You know that basic piece of writing advice, write about what you know. Well, that's good advice, but it also can have a downside. And as a writer, you need to be writing about something that is credible, but also that actually appeals to a lot of people. So it's finding that balance, writing about what you know, but writing about what is relevant and interesting to other people. And that's what we're going to be looking at here, is that balance point. Most of us start our writing based on something that we know, something that happened to us, or maybe something that we heard on a bus, or we read on social media, or we read in the paper. This is good. It means that our writing has a real solid foundation. But there's also a bit of a problem there, because one of the temptations is, particularly if it's something that happened to us, is that we hold it tight. We keep it too close. We don't want to change things. We want to make it exactly what happened to us. And we don't want to let it go and give it to our reader. So this attachment to our writing can often happen because we're writing about our own experience. Now, I'm going to be talking specifically about poetry because that's my genre, but this applies to all types of writing. And if you use your own experience to craft a piece of writing, if someone criticizes it, it can feel as if they're criticizing you and they're criticizing your experience and your view of the world. And obviously, that can be quite upsetting. So this writing about what you know has this downside associated with it. Another thing about writing about what you know about your personal experience is that it's really tempting to include details that aren't really relevant, details that matter to you, but really the reader doesn't care about them, or they don't say the same thing to the reader as they do to you because you lived that experience. This was something that you went through. An example from one of my poems, I'd included a line, "We stand on the pavement waiting for the Lord Mayor's show." Now, as a child, we used to go up to London and watch the Lord Mayor's show every year, and it was an event and it was an experience. And I know exactly what it felt like. I know exactly what I was watching. I know exactly how long we had to wait and how cold our feet were. And all of that came through in those very few words. For me, they were enough to conjure this whole experience. Now, I gave this poem to a friend of mine who is a very good poet, and I asked him for some feedback on that. And the exact words that he used were, "The only possible defense for this incidental banality is it really happened." And you know that's insufficient. Well, fortunately, I was used to getting that sort of feedback. I was used to that sort of negativity. And I realized, I did know that was insufficient. The fact that it happened to me, the fact that, it hadn't happened to the reader, and I hadn't told the reader enough for them to care that it had happened to me. So that line needed either to be taken out completely or needed to be made into part of the poem. It wasn't as it was. As I'd written it, it was not part of the poem. It didn't add anything like what I thought it added. Imagine then that you're writing a poem about the day that you met your wife. Now, maybe you have this image in your mind about seeing your wife and she's wearing, a pink coat. But actually the day that you met her was a spring day and you were in the park and you've got all those daffodils. Maybe it would be more poetic if her coat was green or yellow like the daffodils. Or maybe the colour of her coat doesn't matter to anybody but you and your wife. Maybe it doesn't actually add anything to what's going on. Yes, it's important, and I'm sure that your wife is going to be very impressed by the fact that you remember what she was wearing when you met her. but your reader may not care, and it may not be important that your reader cares. Maybe that's just a detail that you can put to one side and tell your wife that you've remembered, but don't include it in your poem. If you remember that marvellous song, I met him on a Monday and my heart stood still. Somebody told me that his name was Bill. That phrase, I met him on a Monday. Lovely, alliterative language, but I think I can remember an interview with Phil Spector when he said, actually, the chances of meeting someone on a Monday are fairly limited. We tend to go out Fridays, Saturdays, end of the week. That's the day that everyone meets the love of their life. That's the day that it normally happens. This whole I met him on a Monday, it was all about the alliteration. It had nothing to do with a reality, even an imagined reality. It was just there for the sound. Now, of course, if you want to write a poem in which you met your wife on a Friday and she was wearing a pink coat and all the other stuff, well, there's nothing wrong with writing it. Just it isn't so likely to appeal to the rest of the world. And maybe what you're doing there is writing a really nice little love letter to your wife. You're writing a journal entry. You're writing a piece of creative nonfiction, or you're writing a memoir. Probably what you're not doing is writing poetry. It's this removal of the reality or using the reality as a jumping off point, using it as a stepping stone to poetry, not sitting firmly on that stepping stone like this is the reality, this is what happens, and I've got to keep all those details in there. Most of them aren't relevant. Many of them are not going to touch your reader. So maybe you can omit them. And this is one of the problems when you come to writing about things like when a loved one dies or when something really personal and important matters to you. It's difficult to disconnect yourself enough, certainly not immediately, because those details do matter and they are what makes the experience real to you. And so if someone comes along and says, that doesn't work, that's banal, that's incidental, leave it out, you're going to feel crushed. And that is one of the reasons that you need to leave the big things that you want to write about them immediately, but don't immediately rush out and ask for feedback or rush out and hope to get published, because it's the distance that will probably make them more poetic, make them more publishable. Yes, there's the importance of the raw emotion, and there are places where that is the right thing and that is what is going to be looked for. But as a general piece of general recommendation, general piece of advice, I would say, if you're writing about something which has really upset or really made a huge difference to your life, hang on to it, write it, hang on to it until you've got some distance to be able to reflect and say, is that now good writing, or is that part of my journal? And that is why actually asking your friends and family to give you feedback isn't always the best thing, because if you give your wife a poem about meeting her and you actually met her on a Wednesday afternoon and you say it was, it was a Tuesday and she knows she was wearing this and you describe something else, and she's going to say, that's not what really happened. And she's going to notice and it's going to matter to her and she's going to think you forgot. Or, it's these things, your friends and family are likely to know that the reality was different, and they are not necessarily going to understand that what you're trying to do now is write creative writing, you're trying to write poetry, you're trying to step away from that minute accuracy and create something that is going to evoke the emotion that it evoked in you when it happened, and evoke that in your reader's mind, even when your reader has never met your wife, has never done what you did, has never experienced what you experienced. So friends and family, their feedback can sometimes be lovely because they like you usually, and they want to say how nice your writing is, how good it is, how much they love it. But particularly if it's a shared experience, they're going to notice the bits that you've left out. They're going to notice the things that aren't right. But what we're trying to do is not write what's right. We're trying to write something creative, something publishable, something that is going to touch our reader. Having said that, I will say that it does depend on what you want to do with your writing, because if you're writing for, I don't know, a speech at a wedding, or you're writing for a book of memoirs that you're going to hand down to grandchildren or whatever, then yes, you probably should try and get things right. But if you're trying to write for a general public, I would say try and make it good writing. Don't try and make it right.